Part I, Chapter 6 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Schools of Charlemagne. The rulers immediately before Charlemagne were of barbarian origin, and had no sympathy with the classic treasures. They could not appreciate the literary wealth of the countries which they conquered. They even had little respect for the poetic literature of their own countries. Theodoric could not even write his own name. Charlemagne introduced a new order. He was the first of the barbaric rulers to see the importance of learning, and, while not educated himself, he knew the value of education as a source of prosperity for his dominions. He surrounded himself with learned men. Alcuin of England was his adviser in all literary matters. Charlemagne entrusted him with the organization of schools, and had him report constantly concerning the state of education among his subjects. Guizot calls Alcuin the intellectual prime minister of Charlemagne. Longfellow draws the following picture of Alcuin in the Palatine School. In sooth, it was a pleasant sight to see That Saxon monk, with hood and rosary, with ink horn at his belt, and pen and book, and mingled love and reverence in his look; or hear the cloister and the court repeat the measured footfalls of his sandaled feet, or watch him with the pupils of his school, gentle of speech, but absolute of rule. But Charlemagne had other scholars about him, such as Clement of Ireland, Peter of Pisa, Paul the Deacon, Eginhard, Paul of Aquileia, and Theodulf. These were the true paladins of his literary court. The old universities of the classic world had been located in the lands overrun by the Saracens, and were now blotted out of existence. Their place was occupied by seminaries, where only theology was taught. The education of the better part of Europe was in the hands of the Church. The episcopal seminaries had been seats of clerical learning from the primitive period, but these had been interrupted by the onslaughts of the barbarians. Charlemagne saw their value, began to restore them to their old importance, and enlarged the curriculum of study. Out of these episcopal seminaries grew, 4 centuries afterwards, some of the great universities of modern Europe. Charlemagne took pains to establish grammar and public schools. These were purely secular, and were of popular character. They were preparatory to the seminaries and to all the secular professions. Theodulf, Bishop of Orleans, was deputed to establish village schools for all classes. Then, for the first time in Europe, learning was made free for all. For the children of his court, Charlemagne had schools connected with his palace, or the School Palatine. To enrich the more ignorant portions of his empire, he provided endowments for the support of schools. England, Italy, and Greece were drawn upon to furnish manuscripts for the new libraries. A special imperial constitution was adopted, which regulated the course of study and all other matters connected with the schools. The old trivium and quadricium arrangement was adopted. Under the former were embraced philology, logic, and rhetoric. Under the latter, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Here the average monk, like Eginhard, grew up in logic point device, perfect in grammar, and in rhetoric wise; science of numbers, geometric art, and lore of stars, and music knew by heart; a minnesinger, long before the times, of those who sang their love in Indian rhymes. A strong theological bias was given to all studies. Music was largely limited to chanting, and astronomy to the calculation of Easter. The emperor took great pains to locate his schools in proper places. That he was wise in his selection can be seen in the fact that some of these schools have existed ever since. He established about 50 schools of high grade. Italy, Germany, and France were most favored. Among the schools which he organized were the following: Paris, Tours, Corbie, Orleans, Lyons, Toulouse, Clugny, Mainz, Treves, Cologne, Utrecht, Fulda, Paderborn, and Hildesheim. The cultivation of national literature by Charlemagne was a favorite pursuit. He ruled over a heterogeneous people. Some of the tribes were advanced, and already had a taste of the classic fountains, but the most were in dense barbarism. The emperor caused grammars to be compiled in the languages of his Teutonic subjects, and collected the bardic lays of Germany. He required that the sermon should be preached in the vulgar tongue, and that the common people should have the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer in their own languages. Stripes and fasts were the penalty of neglect. Special measures were taken for the circulation of the Scriptures. Copies were multiplied by the monks, and were distributed among the schools. Many found their way into private hands. Theological literature received a strong impetus. The monasteries became busy places, and many of the monks became authors. Their works were largely reproductions of the Fathers, but occasionally the quiet atmosphere was disturbed by an original manuscript. The decline in literary activity began immediately after the death of the great Charles. The Church fattened on his educational beginnings. The bishops and other clergy took education into their own hands. The Carolingian kinglets were unable to cope with Rome when it began to grasp for the possession of the schools. From the sixth century to the eighth, the education of Europe had been ecclesiastical. Under Charlemagne it had broadened to a remarkable degree, and struck its roots deeply into the popular life. It was made the affair of the state, and contributed infinitely to the development of the Church. But now a return to the old order took place. The clergy having secured the school, its broad scope was destroyed. Its general adaptation to the professions and popular education was narrowed. The state lost it, and never gained it until the Reformation of the 16th century. End of chapter 6.